Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Monday's edition of Scotland at 7 with me, Gordon Ross. The trial of the former First Minister Alex Salmond opened in the High Court in Edinburgh today. Mr Salmond is denied 14 charges of sexual assault against 10 women. Mr Salmond's lawyer, Gordon Jackson QC, lodged special defences of consent to 4 of the charges and a special defence of alibi to a 5th charge. The offences were alleged to have been committed at various locations across Scotland, including the First Minister's official Bute House residence in Edinburgh. Lady Dorian, the trial judge, and Lord Justice Clark, Scotland's second most senior judge, told members of the jury that they should consider withdrawing if they had very strong positive or negative views about Salmond that would prevent them from being impartial. Lady Dorian said, "As you will realise, the accused is a very well-known public figure, and the case has attracted a great deal of publicity. It follows that the injunction, indeed the requirement, is that any verdict must be in accordance with the evidence in this case, is of particular significance. Mr Salmond has pled not guilty to all charges and has vowed to defend himself vigorously. The trial is expected to last about 4 weeks." And now to the coronavirus. From a total number of 2,101 coronavirus tests in Scotland, the number of positive cases is at 23 as of today at 2 p.m. The total number of cases in the UK is now at 319, and it's been confirmed today that a 4th person has died from the virus. England's Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty said the latest death was a patient in their 70s who had an underlying health condition and was believed to have contracted the virus in Britain. The patient died at a hospital in central England. At a briefing today, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said, "I can confirm today that we will report 23 cases in Scotland. That's an increase of 5 since yesterday. I want to be very clear, though, that the situation is still that all cases in Scotland so far can be traced either to international travel to affected areas or to other confirmed cases. It is true that that is true of the UK as a whole, and as you know by now, the contain phase involves a focus on identifying those contacts of confirmed cases, people that they have been in close contact with, following up on those individuals and offering testing where necessary and appropriate advice. The timing of moving into the delay phase and then what measures we judge will be most effective in that phase must be driven and are being driven very firmly by good quality scientific advice." Ms Sturgeon went on to comment about the panic buying, saying that in terms of advice to the public, this is to be sensible and not to rush out and buy things because you're worried about shortages. It's often that kind of behaviour that causes the shortages, not any underlying issue. We will be happy and very keen to keep a dialogue with retailers and supermarkets in particular to make sure that they've got the best advice so that we can work together on that kind of public messaging, to make sure that we don't see any unnecessary pressure put on supplies of any particular commodities. Meanwhile, in Westminster, the SNP MP Neil Gray has urged the Department for Work and Pensions to urgently publish advice for job centre staff and welfare claimants to avoid those affected by the coronavirus being sanctioned. Responding to Mr Gray at the Work and Pensions questions, the Minister for Welfare Delivery, Will Quince MP, confirmed that the DWP would not sanction people who are self-isolating for coronavirus and unable to attend job centre appointments, adding that discretion will be used by the DWP. However, the SNP's Work and Pensions spokesperson has said that exercising discretion is not good enough and that guidance must be clear for both advisors and claimants affected by coronavirus, including those who need to self-isolate and those who need to stay at home to care for children who may be off school. He also challenged the sanctions regime, claiming it as callous and punitive on the basis that if the UK government can make allowances for coronavirus victims, then why not all welfare claimants? The SNP MP Patrick Grady also asked the UK government when it was going to publish its advice for job seekers, advisors and those whose job it is to scrutinise what the government is doing, and urged the DWP to be robust in its advice because people aren't going to be reassured by the idea of exercising discretion on something so fundamental. New guidance on coronavirus or COVID-19 has been published that includes workplace advice. It contains guidance for non-healthcare settings, including tips that apply to people working in hotels and hospitality, leisure facilities, entertainment venues, and premises used by community groups. It has general basic hygiene measures and advice from Health Protection Scotland on preventing the spread of infection, and it includes routine cleaning and disinfection of frequently touched objects and surfaces, such as telephones, keyboards, door handles, desks and tables, basic hand washing, highlighted as the most effective way of preventing the spread of infection, hand hygiene promoted by ensuring staff, contractors, service users and visitors have access to hand washing facilities, and alcohol-based hand rub where available. Also, crockery and cutlery in shared kitchen areas should be cleaned with warm water and detergent and dried thoroughly. And also ensuring such food as crisps and sandwiches should not be left open for communal sharing unless individually wrapped. Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, said, "This publication has been circulated following general guidance on basic preventative measures against coronavirus and specific guidance for educational settings. It contains clear practical guidance that will ensure workplace staff have the latest information about COVID-19 and how we can all help to prevent it from spreading. We are well prepared for an outbreak in Scotland, but the public has a vital role to play in helping us contain any positive cases by keeping themselves informed and by following basic hygiene precautions. That includes hand washing, not touching their faces unless their hands are clean, and covering their nose and mouth with a tissue when coughing or sneezing, and then putting the tissue in the bin." Stock markets have plunged on coronavirus recession fears. Wall Street's main stock indexes plummeted and the Dow Jones Industrials crashed 2,000 points on Monday as a 20% slump in oil prices and a rapid spread of the coronavirus amplified fears of a global recession. Trading was halted immediately after the opening as the benchmark S&P 500 SPX tumbled 7% to its lowest since June 2019. Triggering an automatic 15-minute cutout originally put in place to avoid a repeat of Black Monday's crash in 1987, when the Dow slumped by nearly 23%. The FTSE 100 has plunged into a bear market after its worst day in over a decade. The index of leading blue chip shares has just closed for the night down 496 points, or nearly 7.7%, at 5,965 points. That wipes off £124 billion off the value of companies on the FTSE 100 as the global recession fears, COVID-19 worries and the shock of an oil price war rattled the city. There has not been such a big daily fall since early October 2008 after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, triggering the worst financial crisis in decades. It also means that the FTSE 100 is now more than 20% below its recent peak of 7,674 points set on the 17th of January. In city parlance, that means we are now in a bear market. Now moving on, the UK must deliver a climate crisis package ahead of the budget in Westminster. The SNP has set out key demands for the UK government to tackle the climate emergency, renewing pressure on Westminster to follow the Scottish Government's lead. With Scotland leading the way with the world's most ambitious emissions reduction targets in law and tougher, faster interim targets, the SNP has published a package of measures to address the climate crisis, including ensuring the UK accelerates its action to meet Scotland's climate change targets of a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030, net zero carbon emissions no later than 2040, and net zero of all emissions by 2045. Also, to commit to ensuring that the UK remains aligned with the high EU governmental regulations after the transition period, and also securing a green energy deal that will ensure renewable energy schemes get the long-term certainty needed to support investment. Also supporting substantial reforms to the UK tax system to support greener choices, including a greener tax for heating and energy efficiency improvements in homes and businesses, and a new vehicle and tax incentives regime for transport. Also, the ring-fencing of oil and gas receipts, creating a net zero fund to help pay for the energy transition through investment in areas such as renewable energy, electric vehicles and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Alan Brown MP, the SNP's shadow spokesperson for energy and climate change, has said the upcoming budget must not be yet another squandered opportunity for the UK government to take action to tackle the climate emergency. In Scotland, the SNP is leading the way with the world's most ambitious emissions reduction targets in law and a tougher, faster interim targets, with Glasgow also set to host the COP26 later this year. The UK government must use its budget this week to set out a package of measures to tackle climate change and to play its part. The SNP will continue to challenge the Westminster Tory government to commit to redoubling its efforts, and it is why we have set out a package of measures it must implement if it is serious about climate change. Those measures include following the Scottish Government's lead and targets, stepping back from its efforts to roll back on high EU environmental regulations, improving corporate responsibility in tackling climate emergency, reforming the UK tax system to support greener choices and securing a green energy deal and creating a net zero fund. Now, moving on to the oil and gas sector, the SNP has urged the UK government to use the upcoming budget to deliver crucial support for Scotland and the UK's oil and gas sector, as oil prices plunged by almost 27%. Ahead of the budget in Westminster this week, the SNP MP Stephen Flynn has renewed calls on the UK government to take urgent action to support the industry in its time of need, including measures also to ring-fence oil and gas receipts to help transition to a greener, sustainable future. Stephen Flynn, the SNP MP for Aberdeen South, said the impact of the global oil price slump will reverberate around the world, including hitting Scotland's vital oil and gas sector. With the budget due this week, the UK government must use it to deliver crucial support for the sector as a part of a just transition to net zero emissions. The Westminster government failed to support the sector in the last oil price slump, and having just made a screeching U-turn on support for solar and onshore wind, must now once again back the SNP's proposals for sectoral support for the North Sea before it's too late. The oil and gas sector has generated £334 billion of net tax revenues for the government since 1971. Having used it as a cash cow, the Treasury must support it in its time of need. SNP MPs will continue to demand the ring-fencing of oil and gas receipts, creating a net zero fund to help pay for the energy transition through investment in areas such as renewable energy, electric vehicles and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Crucially, we cannot allow communities to be left behind in the transition, which is why the SNP will continue to push for at least £1 billion over 5 years to go to a net zero industrial strategy to help diversify the economies of oil hubs like Aberdeen, Falkirk and Shetland. Now, the Fraser of Allender Institute has criticised Boris Johnson's plans for a bridge. Boris Johnson's plan for a bridge between Scotland and Northern Ireland has received scathing criticism from leading economic analysts. The Fraser of Allender Institute were harshly critical in their description of the proposal, which they noted, and I'm quoting here, is not an April Fool. The Institute said it won't deliver the economic boost that some claim. It isn't a priority. It would go in the wrong direction, it wouldn't be consistent with climate change objectives, and the money could be better spent on other things. SNP MSP Tom Arthur said, if Boris Johnson has $20 billion to spend on infrastructure, then we're happy to send him some suggestions. But as the Fraser of Allender Institute rightly pointed out, a road bridge or a tunnel across the Irish Sea is hardly a priority. Boris Johnson couldn't build a bridge across the Thames when he was the London mayor, but he thinks that we're going to trust him to deliver one of the most complicated infrastructure projects imaginable. Everyone knows the Tories have no intention of delivering this, as always. This is just a way for Boris Johnson to distract from the failures of a decade of Tory austerity. If the Tories can't explain why the Fraser of Allender Institute are wrong, then they should be laughed out of every room where they mention this daft plan. The Scottish Greens transport spokesperson, John Finney MSP, said, this analysis shows how utterly ridiculous Boris Johnson's proposed bridge really is. If there really is a £20 billion available for major infrastructure projects, this could play a huge role in our efforts to tackle the climate crisis. We could renew Scotland's entire public ferry fleet, support councils to establish new publicly owned bus services, and make much needed improvements to our rail network, like redualling the Mulgai to Highland main lines and reopening the Dunfermline to Alloa route. It's time for this Tory government to either put up or shut up, rather than perpetually droning on about this absurd road to nowhere. Now, our next story concerns Russia. In an exclusive report in The Guardian today, has accused Russia of hiring a network of British politicians and consultants to help advance its criminal interests and to go after Vladimir Putin's enemies in London. MPs who drew up the Russia report suppressed by Boris Johnson were told. In secret evidence submitted to the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, the campaigner and financier Bill Browder claimed that Moscow had been able to infiltrate UK society by using well-paid British intermediaries. Some had reason to know exactly what they were doing and for whom, Browder told the committee. Others work unwittingly for Russian state interests, he said. The alleged intermediaries include politicians from both Labour and the Conservative parties, former intelligence officers and diplomats, and leading public relations firms. Collectively, they form what Browder calls a Western buffer network. There is no suggestion in Browder's testimony that British citizens broke the law. The regime in Moscow uses these professionals to mask its entangled state and criminal interests, he alleged. It deploys them to attack Putin's critics, to enhance Russian propaganda and disinformation, and to facilitate and conceal massive money laundering operations, he said. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov called Browder's claims false and totally groundless. Questions about corruption at the heart of the Russian state were a perfect example of the maniac-style Russophobia, Peskov has said. With his permission, The Guardian is publishing Browder's previously confidential evidence to the ISC. The committee carried out a 2-year investigation behind closed doors into how the Kremlin is seeking to influence and subvert UK politics and society. Its 50-page report was ready for release last November, before the election. The Prime Minister was accused of refusing to publish it. Downing Street cleared the document after the election. It claims that the final document contains little new information and is underwhelming, although others who have read it disagree. Opposition MPs said Browder's evidence demonstrated the need to publish the report as soon as possible. Mr Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, wrote to Mr Johnson a month ago asking for a timetable for the report's publication, which requires Downing Street to appoint a new 9-member cross-party committee of MPs and peers. But nearly 3 months after the election, that process is only in its early stages, and it's likely to be a few weeks at least before the long-awaited report is able to be issued, partly because new members need to be vetted before they can sit. Browder was one of several expert witnesses invited to give evidence to MPs and peers. In September 2018, he submitted a 14-page statement which included a number of recommendations. They include setting up a US-style register of individuals working for foreign state interests, as well as extra resources for regulators, investigators, police and prosecutors. He calls on Companies House in London to review filings made by firms linked to Russian money laundering scandals. Speaking to The Guardian, Browder said, yes, there are members of the Russian security services working out of the Russian embassy under diplomatic cover. What the government seems to be missing is the fact that there are all sorts of informal espionage networks. There are Russian oligarchs who have a much greater impact on the security of this country. What is most shocking is that the Russian government is indirectly hiring British nationals to assist them in its intelligence operations. Browder argues that the Russian state and organised crime have in effect merged. Money stolen from the budget and private companies is used to enrich senior officials, including Putin, and to finance black ops and special projects, he told the ISC. The Kremlin has issued multiple Interpol warrants for Browder's arrest and says he is a criminal. It has convicted him in absentia of tax evasion and deliberate bankruptcy. Browder says he's the victim of a vendetta by corrupt state officials and denies all the charges. Browder's fund, Hermitage Capital Management, was once the biggest foreign investor in the Russian market. He fell out with the authorities after, he says, calling for a clean-up of companies in which Putin and his inner circle have financial interests. In 2005, Russia deported him from Moscow. Officials linked to the FSB spy agency subsequently stole $230 million in taxes paid by the fund to the Russian treasury, Browder alleges. In 2009, his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, died in custody. Browder persuaded the US and some other Western governments to sanction senior officials allegedly involved in human rights abuses. The Kremlin was furious. It paid British firms to advance false narratives of fraud, Browder told the ISC. One official allegedly involved, Andrew Pavlov, made an unsuccessful attempt to keep his name off a European Parliament sanctions list, hiding the Labour former Attorney General Lord Goldsmith to a lobby on his own behalf. Lord Goldsmith's law firm received a £75,000 fee, Browder claims. The firm, Debevoise and Plimpton, said it could not comment on confidential client matters, but that Pavlov denied wrongdoing. It added, everyone is entitled to legal representation. Debevoise provides legal representation consistent with the profession's best traditions of integrity and probity. We will continue fearlessly to defend the interests of all our clients. Pavlov retained the services of GPW, a business intelligence company run by a former MI6 officer, Andrew Fulton. Browder says GPW's brief included gathering intelligence on him. Fulton, a chairman of the Scottish Conservative Party, left GPW in 2017. Its managing director, Philip Warman, said he could not comment on any aspect of our work. Fulton's former GPW colleague, Andrew Wordsworth, said that Pavlov is entitled to know the facts of his case. The use of sanctions against individuals is a pretty draconian remedy. Some people would argue that before you destroy people's lives, they should be able to defend themselves. In his evidence, Browder alleges that Pavlov also hired Linton Crosby's communications firm CFT, paying it £45,000. However, CFT denies Browden's allegations. It says Goldsmith's law firm hired a separate entity, CFT, Corporate and Financial Communications, to research the EU sanctions landscape. CFT advised the law firm and there was no contact with Pavlov. This was the extent of our involvement. To try and claim otherwise would be utterly false. It said, according to Companies House records, Crosby is a CFT-CFC director. There is no suggestion that Crosby personally worked on or was aware of the work on EU sanctions carried out by CTFC, until it appeared in the media. Linton Crosby was working exclusively on the 2015 general election campaign for the Conservative Party at this time, and had no client involvement outside the Conservative Party, it said, adding that Crosby had never met or worked with Goldsmith or Debevoise. Browder further names British individuals who have fronted up offshore companies used in the alleged Magnitsky fraud and in other cases. The UK citizens appear as nominal directors of non-transparent firms in countries through which billions of dollars have been laundered, including the UK, Russia, Ukraine, Cyprus and Latvia. And now to the EU. The European Union is to rehouse up to 1,500 child refugees living in Greek camps. The European Union has said that it will rehouse up to 1,500 child refugees living in Greek camps amid a standoff between Brussels and Turkey's President Recep Erdogan over his decision to open his border to migrants travelling to Europe. The presidents of the European Commission and Council, Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, are to meet Erdogan on Monday evening, just over a week after he had encouraged thousands of migrants and refugees to pass through Turkey into the EU. With the conditions at the border crossings and the Greek refugee camps degrading by the day, the German government said on Monday that the EU was considering taking between 1,000 and 1,500 unaccompanied children. A humanitarian solution is being negotiated at the European level for a coalition of the willing to take in these children, it said. Speaking at a press conference to mark her first 100 days in office, von der Leyen confirmed that 5 EU member states had so far come forward to offer help. The countries helping are France, Portugal, Germany, Luxembourg and Finland. In the long term, we need to process a deal with unaccompanied minors. We need a systematic approach, she said. Von der Leyen said the EU needed to make sure that when unaccompanied minors end up in these camps, that we have a mechanism to deal with them and a way to ensure that they enjoy a safe future. The Commission President said that the talks with Erdogan in Brussels would be the beginning of a process to see how much further the EU could financially support Turkey in dealing with migrants coming in from war-torn states. The EU agreed in 2016 to provide Turkey with €6 billion in return for curbs on migration flows. But Erdogan claims that the true cost has been closer to €40 billion. The money promised has been paid or it has been contracted, von der Leyen said. We ask ourselves, how will the next step be? But this is the very beginning. She added, the events at the Greek-Turkish border clearly point to politically motivated pressure on the EU's external border. Finding a solution to this situation will require relieving the pressure that is put on the border. The crisis has unfolded on the borders between Turkey and its EU neighbours Greece and Bulgaria, since Erdogan announced last week that he would be opening the doors for refugees fleeing Idlib province, the final rebel stronghold in Syria. Erdogan has repeatedly criticised the EU's lack of burden sharing, claiming that Turkey can no longer cope with the numbers of people that are seeking asylum. The result of his policy has been that about 35,000 people have gathered at the border with Greece, where they have clashed with Greek police, who have fired tear gas and plastic bullets. Vigilante groups have started intimidating people at the border, and last week it was reported that residents on the island of Lesbos had blocked a dinghy full of people travelling from Turkey from disembarking, including a pregnant woman and children. Erdogan stirred the situation on Sunday by giving a speech in Istanbul, calling the Greek government to open the gates itself to allow migrants and refugees to move on to the rest of Europe. I hope I will return from Belgium with different outcomes, Erdogan said. Hey Greece, I appeal to you. Open the gates as well and be free of this burden. Let them go to other European countries. After the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, a former Foreign Minister of Spain, met Erdogan in Ankara last Wednesday, he promised an additional €170 million in aid for vulnerable groups in Syria. But on Friday, Europe's foreign ministers refused to accede to Turkish demands for more financial aid. Over the weekend, Johannes Hahn, the EU Budget Commissioner, also suggested that Erdogan was using the crisis to distract from his own weakened position at home. It's the standard reflex in response to all of this. You seek an external opponent, Hahn told the Austrian newspaper Der Standard. Of course, the flow of refugees is being steered. On Monday, a former close Erdogan ally became the latest to register a new political organisation to challenge the ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP, saying that Turkey needed a fresh start. Ali Babakan, 52, a former deputy prime minister, quit the AKP last July, citing deep differences about its direction. Last December, another one-time Erdogan ally, the former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, established the Future Party to rival the AKP. Now, we are now going to move to America for our next story. The Democratic contender Joe Biden, who is seeking to deliver a knockout blow to rival Bernie Sanders on Tuesday, as 6 states vote, received another boost on Monday when former presidential hopeful Cory Booker endorsed his campaign. The US Senator from New Jersey, who ended his own White House bid in January, wrote on Twitter that Biden would restore the honour of the Oval Office. Booker's endorsement, one day after another one-time candidate, Senator Kamala Harris of California, also backed the former vice president, means that Biden has picked up the backing of 2 black former presidential contenders as he seeks the party's nomination to take on the Republican President Donald Trump this fall. Biden, over the past 9 days, has paired to the front of the contest for the Democratic nomination. A wave of endorsements by his former rivals has made him a clear standard-bearer for the Democratic Party's moderate wing, while Sanders represents the party's more liberal elements. Booker and Harris were planning to campaign with Biden on Monday in Michigan, the biggest prize in Tuesday's voting. A win in the Midwestern Rust Belt state could give Biden an insurmountable lead in the number of delegates needed to win the nomination in the party's July convention. Mr. Sanders, a US Senator from Vermont, may need a victory in Michigan to recapture momentum after Biden showed surprising strength in last week's Super Tuesday contests. An opinion poll from the Detroit Free Press published on Monday found that Biden is holding a 24 percentage point lead over Sanders among Democratic voters in Michigan. Sanders will hold a rally on Monday in St. Louis in Missouri, along with Michigan, Mississippi, Washington State, Idaho, North Dakota will hold contests on Thursday. Sanders will then return to Michigan, where he is due to join a roundtable on the coronavirus in Detroit. Michigan officials on Friday said that they would take steps, including having clerks repeatedly sanitize voting booths to alleviate the risk of infection spreading at polling places. Washington State, which has seen the largest US cluster of coronavirus, conducts its primary election by mail. Biden will make stops in Michigan cities of Grand Rapids and Flint before holding a rally alongside Harris and Booker in Detroit, where the majority of the population is African American. The event will give Biden an enviable visual on the eve of an election for the second straight week. Biden appeared with former rivals Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar and Beto O'Rourke just hours before the polls opened last week. One of the most talked about moments of Harris's campaign was her blistering June debate attack on Biden. She called his remarks about working with segregationist senators hurtful and questioned Biden's 1970s opposition to school busing. Still, black voters have backed Biden overwhelmingly and propelled him to big victories in South Carolina on February the 29th and on Super Tuesday. They will be crucial in Michigan, where they comprise almost 14% of the population. Now, coming to our next story, we are now coming back to Scotland. While most property short-term lets advertised on sites such as Airbnb and Booking.com may be unlawful, according to early results of a survey by the Scottish Green MSP Andy Whiteman. An online tracking tool to chart the scale of short-term lets in Scotland was launched in January by Andy Whiteman, and he can reveal that 339 commercial short-term lets recorded so far, only one has planning consent. If these results are replicated across Scotland, that would suggest 99.7% of short-term lets in Scotland could be unlawful. There are 480 listings for Edinburgh on the website of a public agency, Visit Scotland. This new data would suggest that the vast majority of these could be unlawful. The Lothians MSP, who has led on the issue, said, "This early picture from my home's first site reveals a depressing truth of how out of control this sector is. All but one of the properties identified so far have no planning consent to be a short-term let. Any property that should have planning consent but does not is unlawful." So while proposing a new licensing powers are welcome, they will not be of much use if owners are so willing to flout the planning laws. The Scottish Government's commitment to regulation is further undermined by the fact that Visit Scotland, which has a strategic partnership with Airbnb, is actively promoting holiday accommodation that is unlawful despite encouraging visitors to book only licensed and regulated accommodation. Scottish ministers should ask their own tourism agency to stop advertising unlawful businesses. And now, £200,000 is being made available for Coasts and Waters heritage projects. Make a splash with Historic Environment Scotland's new funding programme. Historic Environment Scotland is encouraging organisations with community-based projects to apply for its new Coasts and Waters Heritage Fund, which launches today, Monday the 9th of March, for the year of Coasts and Waters. As a part of the new scheme, grants between £3,000 and £20,000 will be available for projects which help communities to protect, promote or engage with Scotland's coastal or waterway. These include projects which are developing and implementing measures to enhance resilience and to adapt to climate change. While community groups are encouraged to apply, the scheme is open to all organisations throughout the country. All applicants, however, should demonstrate how their project will benefit the local community. This could be through developing traditional skills, stabilising historic marine structures, hosting community outreach and educational activities, or increasing people's understanding of Scotland's coast and waters heritage. The Coast and Waters Heritage Fund is a one-off competitive fund to celebrate Scotland's themed year, and applications will close on Sunday the 31st of May. Jane Ryder, OBE, the chair of HES, said that for thousands of years, communities across Scotland have lived and worked along or near the water, and the Year of Coasts and Waters provides an excellent opportunity to engage people with our coastal and waterway heritage. Through this new grant programme, we are encouraging communities not only to celebrate our coasts and waters, but also to explore opportunities to adapt to the effects of climate change and to help ensure that this important aspect of our heritage is protected for future generations. The launch of the Coast and Waters Heritage Fund follows the publication of HES's Climate Action Plan, which outlines an ambitious programme of climate commitments over the next 5 years and beyond in response to the climate crisis. To apply for the Coast and Waters Heritage Fund, an expression of interest must be made by Thursday, the 30th of April, and applications will close on Sunday, April the 31st. And that is our show this evening for you tonight. I'm sorry we have no guest this evening, but I'll be back again on Thursday with another edition of Scotland at 7. Until then, you'll be, I hope, in the capable hands of my colleague Kenny when he gets back out of hospital from his knee operation. Anyway, that is it from our studios here in Cowcaddens for tonight. Very good night to you all. I'll see you tomorrow. Oh, I beg your pardon. I'm just being told that Kenny will be here tomorrow. Yeah, sorry, we've just heard that Kenny's having an operation on his knee, but he will be in tomorrow. Anyway, that's it from us tonight. I'll see you again on Thursday. In the meantime, it's time as usual for me to ask you to donate. So if you would like to become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland and help us to make more programmes, then you can do so by following the instructions on your screen now by going to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. And of course, we appreciate every one of your donations individually as well. That's it from me tonight. I will be back again on Thursday. Kenny will be taking the show tomorrow. In the meantime, from me, a very good night to you.